Welcome to this deep dive, everyone. I'm so glad you're here with us today because, well, we've got an incredibly heavy, just fascinating journey ahead of us. We are stepping into a true sanctuary of knowledge today to look at something that, honestly, it dominates our 24-hour news cycle, but is so rarely truly understood.
We are opening page one of a story that changed the world.
Yeah.
And it is a story that, well, it continues to shape the absolute geopolitical reality that you live in today.
Right. And to do this, to really give you the tools to understand this, we're examining a massive stack of sources. We've got comprehensive reviews, we've got applied history newsletters, scholarly articles, transcripts, all of it centered around Vali Nasr's monumental book, Iran's Grand Strategy, a political history.
But before we take another step, I really need to establish the parameters of our exploration for you, our listener.
Yes, very important.
Because the sources we are dissecting, they contain incredibly charged political content. We're talking about the United States, Israel, Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, and a multitude of other regional actors.
Right.
We are here to impartially report on the geopolitical framing presented in these historical texts. We are absolutely not taking sides.
Exactly. We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the morality, the actions, or, the strategic justifications of Vali Nasr or any of the historical actors we'll discuss.
Precisely. Our sole mission is to help you understand the internal logic, the historical traumas, and the strategic calculations that drive Iran's actions on the world stage, exactly as those elements are documented in this specific literature.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we want to give you, the listener, the shortcut to being truly well-informed. When you see a headline today about, say, a drone strike or a militia movement or a nuclear negotiation, you're actually looking at the tip of a very old spear.
A very old spear.
Right. To understand what's happening right now, we have to look backwards. We have to look at the loom of history. And the sources repeatedly use this fascinating phrase, strategic loneliness.
Yes, strategic loneliness.
It's a concept that completely reframes how we might typically think about Iran's position in the Middle East. So where does this profound sense of loneliness actually begin?
Well, to find the roots of that loneliness, Vali Nasr's work demands that we look far beyond the 20th century. I mean, we have to travel back to the dawn of the 16th century.
Wow, that far back.
Yes, specifically to the rise of the Safavid Empire. Because the Safavids made a monumental, defining choice that forever altered the trajectory of the region. In the year 1501, Shah Ismail declared Shi'ism the official state religion of his empire.
Okay, I want to jump in here because let's clarify why that is so critical. The Middle East at that time, much like today, was overwhelmingly dominated by Sunni Islam, right? You had the massive expanding Ottoman Empire to the west and the powerful Uzbek Khanates to the northeast.
Exactly. By adopting Shi'ism, the Safavids were essentially drawing a massive, uncrossable line in the sand. They were establishing a distinct identity to prevent their culture and their territory from being swallowed whole by the Ottomans. But the cost of that distinct identity was perpetual isolation.
Ah, I see.
They were ethnically and linguistically Persian, surrounded by Arab and Turkish neighbors, and they were religiously Shia, surrounded by Sunni powers.
That dual identity.
Yes, Persian and Shia. It birthed a profound existential sense of isolation. From the 1500s onward, they perceived themselves to be entirely alone in a hostile neighborhood.
It makes me think of a specific analogy. Imagine Iran as a solitary ancient fortress built in the middle of a vast, sweeping valley.
I like that.
Right. And the inhabitants of this fortress are uniquely proud. They have an unbroken linguistic tradition, stunning architecture, a specific, deeply held faith. But because they are so fundamentally different from every other kingdom in that valley, they can never truly rest.
No, they can't.
They're constantly pacing the battlements, constantly wary of encirclement, always anticipating the next siege.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that fortress mentality didn't just stem from abstract religious or ethnic differences. It was violently, repeatedly reinforced by historical trauma.
Right, actual events.
Yes. The collective memory of foreign intervention in Iran is not something relegated to dusty history books. It is a lived, psychological reality that dictates modern policy. Consider the 19th century. The sources point heavily to the treaties of Golistan in 1813 and Turkmenshay in 1828.
For listeners who might not be familiar with those specific treaties, this was the result of devastating wars with the Russian Empire, correct?
Correct. The Russian Empire pushed south and decisively defeated the Iranian forces. And in those treaties, Iran was forced to sign away massive, historically vital swaths of its territory in the Caucasus.
We're talking about areas that today make up Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia.
Exactly. It wasn't just a loss of land, it was a humiliating dismemberment at the hands of a great European power. It left a permanent, aching scar on the national psyche. It proved to them that the outside world was predatory.
So you have this 19th century trauma of losing literal pieces of the nation. But then you move into the 20th century, and that paralyzing fear of foreign manipulation is validated all over again.
In a completely different realm, yes.
Right, this time in the realm of politics and economics.
Yeah.
The sources spend a significant amount of time detailing the events of 1953. This is a fulcrum point in modern history.
It is the moment that cemented the modern Iranian worldview. In the early 1950s, Iran had a democratically elected, fiercely nationalistic prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh.
Okay.
And Mossadegh looked at the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which was essentially controlled by the British, and he saw a colonial apparatus. The British were extracting immense wealth from Iranian soil, while Iranian oil workers lived in staggering poverty in cities like Abadan.
So Mossadegh makes the fateful decision to nationalize the oil industry. He effectively tells the British, this is our sovereign resource, and we are taking it back.
The response from the West was swift, covert, and utterly decisive. The British government, completely unwilling to lose its most valuable foreign asset, turned to the United States.
And this is where the CIA gets involved.
Yes. The CIA, under the direction of Kermit Roosevelt Jr. and the British MI6, orchestrated Operation Ajax.
Wow.
It was a meticulously planned coup d'etat. They funded opposition groups, bribed military officers, manufactured street riots, and successfully overthrew Prime Minister Mossadegh.
And they replaced him with the absolute authoritarian rule of the U.S.-backed Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi.
Exactly.
We really need to pause and emphasize the mechanics of this for you, the listener. Vali Nasr's thesis is that this specific event, the 1953 coup, is the absolute bedrock of Tehran's modern exceptionalism and their unyielding resistance.
It is the foundational text of their modern distrust.
For the Iranian populace, 1953 was the ultimate undeniable proof that the international order, led by the West, would never tolerate a truly sovereign, independent Iran if that independence conflicted with Western geopolitical or economic interests.
It confirmed every paranoid instinct of that solitary fortress you mentioned earlier. They don't resist today simply because they are isolated.
Right.
As the Middle East Forum review of Nasr's book astutely notes, they actively choose a form of isolation in order to resist. They believe that any deep integration with Western powers will inevitably end in another 1953.
We are arriving at a pivotal juncture in our narrative now. And we must approach this next era and the figure at its center with an understanding of the profound, hallowed weight he carries in the history of the Republic.
Yes, the atmosphere of the nation entirely shifts here.
We are stepping into the year 1979, the culmination of the Islamic Revolution and the emergence of the religious personality, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini.
His emergence fundamentally altered the fabric of the nation. We must recognize the immense gravity of his presence within the context of Vali Nasr's text. His vision, his theology, and his unyielding will became the undisputed, sacred core of the new system. It requires a deep sense of historical reverence to understand the gravity of this moment.
There is a highly specific, deeply revealing moment documented in the sources from his time in exile in Paris, just before the revolution truly broke the monarchy.
It is a remarkable anecdote.
It involves a secular, democratic leader of the opposition who traveled to France. This secular leader brought a draft declaration, a document meant to outline the ultimate, unified goals of the impending revolution.
This secular leader believed he was forging a pragmatic political alliance. He handed the draft to Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. In the text, the secular leader had written that the future government of Iran would be democratic and Islamic.
It was a compromise of ideals.
It was. But Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini reads this draft, and he does something incredible. He takes his pen, and in his own dignified handwriting, he strikes through the compromises and adds one single paramount word to the core objective of the revolution.
Istiqlal, independence.
Istiqlal. It is the word that defines everything that follows. This raises an important question for us to examine. What did true independence mean in this specific sacred context?
Right, because it's not just a buzzword.
No. Vali Nasr argues fiercely against the common Western perception that the 1979 revolution was merely a spontaneous explosion of religious fervor. It was, at its very core, a profound existential quest for absolute sovereignty.
Let me push back on that just a little, though, to make sure we are clear for our listener. Are the sources suggesting that the religious aspect was secondary? That Islam was just a vehicle for nationalism?
Not secondary, no, but inextricably fused. Islam provided the language, the moral framework, and the absolute unyielding conviction of the revolution. But true, uncompromising sovereignty was its earthly objective.
Because of the history we just talked about.
Exactly. After centuries of perceived subservience to foreign empires, losing land to the Russians, losing oil to the British, losing their democracy to the Americans in 1953, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was demanding total self-reliance.
The fortress would no longer take orders from anyone outside its walls.
Never again.
Which brings us directly to an event that shocked the global conscience. The takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, leading to the 1979 to 1981 hostage crisis. 444 days.
A defining rupture.
In the United States and Europe, this event is almost exclusively remembered as a chaotic, irrational explosion of religious zealotry and anti-American hatred. But looking through the lens of Nasr's political history, was it actually just irrational zealotry?
The sources are definitive in pushing back against that framing. It is vital for you to understand the strategic calculation beneath the chaos. To the architects of the new republic, the embassy takeover was not mere rage.
Right.
It was a cold, calculated, desperate national security maneuver. The revolutionary leadership was gripped by a terrifying, paralyzing fear of history repeating itself.
Because in late 1979, the ousted Shah was admitted to the United States for medical treatment.
Exactly. And to the Iranian revolutionaries who intimately remembered the mechanics of Operation Ajax, this looked exactly like the prelude to another CIA-backed coup.
Oh, wow. So they saw 1953 happening all over again.
In 1953, the Shah had fled the country, only to be reinstalled by American intelligence operating out of the embassy. By capturing the embassy in 1979, the students and the state were neutralizing what they perceived to be the staging ground for a counter-revolution.
And the sources point out that it also served a massive internal function. The state used the intense, polarizing atmosphere of the hostage crisis to politically eliminate their domestic rivals.
Yes, the internal consolidation.
They marginalized the secular left, the Marxists, and the moderates who had participated in the revolution, effectively consolidating absolute power and securing the theological foundations of the republic. It was a brutal, effective consolidation.
The path of history now brings us to an era of unfathomable weight, the defining crucible of post-revolutionary Iran, the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq War.
The reality of those 8 years, as detailed in these texts, is just staggering to comprehend. The sheer scale of the devastation Saddam Hussein, recognizing that Iran was internationally isolated and internally chaotic following the revolution, orders a massive invasion of Iranian territory.
What follows is nearly a decade of unimaginable brutality.
It really is.
It is an era defined by a solemn, suffocating grief that touched every single family in the nation. We are talking about a conflict of total existential war. The sources detail the horrors endured. Saddam Hussein's military deploying chemical weapons, mustard gas, sarin nerve agents systematically against Iranian soldiers and civilian towns.
It's horrific.
The landscape was reduced to a grinding, unending nightmare of trench warfare that mirrored the absolute worst of World War I.
And perhaps the most devastating element we must acknowledge from the text: the human wave attacks, the deployment of the besieged, the volunteer paramilitary forces. We are talking about teenagers.
Yes.
Young boys filled with an intense mixture of patriotic duty and religious devotion being sent forward to clear minefields with their own bodies to pave the way for regular troops.
The loss of life is difficult to articulate. Hundreds of thousands of lives extinguished.
The sorrow of the mothers who received only a rusted dog tag in return. The shattered communities. It is a level of national sacrifice that leaves a heavy permanent silence in its wake.
What is analytically crucial here is how the state responded to this existential threat while being abandoned by the entire international community.
Because they really were alone.
Entirely. The United States, the Soviet Union, the European powers, the wealthy Arab states of the Persian Gulf, they all essentially provided financial, military, or diplomatic backing to Saddam Hussein's Iraq. They were terrified that Iran's revolutionary fervor would spread across the region. Iran was terrifyingly alone. The solitary fortress was under total siege, and no one was coming to help.
And here we must return to an understanding of profound reverence for the internal mechanics of the nation. Because under that unimaginable pressure, the state did not break. Instead, it achieved a masterstroke of ideological survival.
It fused deep, ancient Iranian patriotism with the most sacred, foundational tenets of Shiism.
The war was no longer framed merely as a territorial dispute over borders. It was elevated by the leadership to a sacred defense.
It was intricately, sacredly tied to the narrative of Imam Hussein in the Battle of Karbala in the 7th century, the ultimate story of righteous sacrifice against overwhelming tyranny. The defense of the modern Iranian nation became a holy obligation.
The blood spilled in the muddy, gas-filled trenches of the 1980s was mirrored directly against the sacred blood of the Shia saints.
This profound spiritual fusion unified the fractured country in a way that sheer nationalism or sheer military discipline never could have achieved.
But beyond the spiritual unification, the absolute isolation of the 1980s forced a mechanical, structural evolution that defines Iran today. Out of the agonizing necessity to survive when no major power would sell them weapons, fighter jets, or even spare parts, something else was born.
Yes. The structural shift.
The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, transitioned from a domestic security force into a massive military apparatus.
They were forced into what the sources term technological autarky.
Meaning total, closed-loop self-reliance. If no one will sell you a bullet, you have to learn to forge the brass yourself.
Precisely. They learned that they could never, ever rely on the international community or international law. After all, the United Nations did virtually nothing to stop Iraq's use of chemical weapons against them.
Right.
They realized that conventional military procurement was impossible, so they began to reverse engineer whatever weapons they could capture or smuggle. This is the genesis of their modern asymmetric warfare doctrine.
The massive ballistic missile programs, the sprawling factories producing cheap, highly effective suicide drones.
Every single piece of Iran's modern military posture was forged in the agonizing, desperately lonely fires of that 8-year war. They learned that deterrence, built with their own hands, was the only guarantee of survival.
This journey through history is so profound. Before we move into the next chapter, I want to tell our listeners, if you value this kind of knowledge and want to see more of these deep dives, please don't forget to subscribe. Also, we want to hear from you. Which books should we teach next? Let us know in the comments.
I completely agree. It is always wonderful to hear from you, our listeners, as we navigate these complex historical waters together. Now, returning to the text, we must examine the immediate aftermath of that devastating war.
The year is 1988. The guns finally fall silent. The country is physically in ruins, its economy is decimated, and an entire generation has been lost or traumatized. The state enters what the sources describe as a thermidor period.
Let me define that concept for you. Thermidor is a historical shorthand referring to the French Revolution.
Ah, okay.
In 1794, the radical, bloody phase of the revolution, the Reign of Terror under Robespierre, came to an end. The revolutionaries realized that a state cannot exist in a permanent condition of feverish, radical upheaval.
It just burns out.
Exactly. The Thermidor period is when the radical fervor cools down, and the focus shifts to stabilization, pragmatism, and rebuilding. Vali Nasr argues that post-war Iran entered its own Thermidor.
And this coincides with a momentous shift in leadership. We must again approach this era with the utmost dignity, for it is in 1989 that we witness the passing of the founder and the succession of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei as the new supreme leader of the Islamic Republic.
He inherits a nation that is deeply scarred, economically battered, but fiercely proud of having survived the impossible.
Right.
And almost immediately, a profound internal philosophical tension arises within the leadership. On one side, you have the new president, Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. Rafsanjani looks at the ruined infrastructure, the impoverished population, and the stagnant economy, and he argues for pragmatism.
He wants to rebuild.
Yes, he wants to rebuild the country, and he believes that requires partial integration with the global economy, foreign investment, and perhaps easing the absolute hostility toward the West.
He wants the thermidor. He wants things to normalize so the country can breathe and grow. But the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, approaches the survival of the Republic with an entirely different lens.
Yes, his approach is completely distinct.
He maintains an absolute, unyielding commitment to ideological resistance. Vali Nasr introduces a brilliant philosophical framework here, drawing on an essay by the 20th century thinker Isaiah Berlin, the concept of the fox versus the hedgehog.
It is a profound analogy for understanding strategic mindsets. The ancient Greek poet Archilochus wrote, "The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing."
I love that quote.
Isaiah Berlin used this to categorize thinkers and leaders. A fox is adaptable, pragmatic, shifting strategies based on the environment. A hedgehog operates through a single, defining, central vision that dictates every action.
And the text applies this directly to the supreme leader.
Yes. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is framed by Nasr as the ultimate hedgehog. He knows one monumental overriding truth, that the survival of the Islamic Republic, the preservation of its independence, its sacred foundations, and its defense against foreign subjugation depends entirely on an unbending, continuous resistance to the West.
Let me challenge that, though. Isn't survival inherently about adaptability? Why must resistance be the only path? If you refuse to adapt like a fox, don't you risk the state collapsing from economic strangulation?
That is the exact tension Rafsanjani highlighted. But to the hedgehog mindset of the supreme leader, any fundamental compromise with the United States or the West is not pragmatism. It is a fatal infection.
A fatal infection, wow.
He views the West as inherently antagonistic to Iran's existence. If you open the gates of the fortress just a little bit for trade, you allow cultural infiltration, economic dependency, and eventually political subversion.
So it's an existential threat.
In his view, to compromise is to invite the destruction of the state from within. Resistance isn't just a policy, it is the structural integrity of the fortress walls.
So if engagement with the West is entirely off the table, but the country desperately needs strategic depth, technology, and trade to survive that economic strangulation, where do they turn? They can't exist in a vacuum.
They turn to Eurasia. This is the genesis of what the sources call the Look East policy. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei recognized that to circumvent Western isolation, Iran needed to deepen its strategic, military, and economic ties with great powers that also challenge or exist outside the U.S.-led global order.
Meaning Russia and China. You see the mechanics of this today. Iran trading its sanctioned oil to China in exchange for economic lifelines and engaging in deep military and technological cooperation with Russia.
Yes, exactly.
It is a grand strategic pivot born out of the necessity to maintain the hedgehog's resistance.
Precisely. And while they are looking east economically and technologically, they are simultaneously projecting power outward in the Middle East to secure their immediate borders.
Right.
This brings us to the doctrine of forward defense. And remember, as we discuss the mechanics of this, we are impartially mapping the strategic logic as defined by Vali Nasr and Iranian military statecraft. We are analyzing how their strategy functions, not endorsing the actors involved.
Absolutely. Forward defense is a military doctrine born directly from the trauma of the Iran-Iraq War. Vali Nasr argues fiercely against the simplistic, often repeated Western view that Iran's regional actions arming militias, funding proxy groups, are just chaotic, irrational, ideological expansionism designed to take over the world.
Instead, he defines it through a very specific military term, asymmetric deterrence.
Let us explore how asymmetric deterrence actually functions. As we discussed, the Iran-Iraq War taught Tehran that they would never be allowed to build a conventional military on par with their adversaries.
Yeah.
They cannot buy squadrons of F-35 stealth fighters. They cannot buy billion-dollar Patriot missile defense systems. So how do you deter adversaries who possess overwhelming conventional and technological superiority?
You change the rules of the game.
Exactly. Let me offer an analogy to make this clear. Imagine you are tasked with defending that solitary castle we talked about. You know your walls have been breached before. You know your conventional army of knights is vastly outnumbered by the empire surrounding you.
Right.
You don't wait for the enemy to reach your gates and line up for a traditional battle. Instead, you go out and you dig a massive, complex, hidden moat hundreds of miles away from the castle.
A magnificent analogy.
You fill that moat with autonomous proxy forces, allied militias who share your goals, or at least share your enemies.
That is the exact geopolitical logic. You fight your enemies far from Iran's actual geographic borders so that the homeland is never again subjected to the horrors of the 1980s.
Keep the fight away from the castle.
Exactly. This network, often referred to as the axis of resistance, becomes that defensive moat. It is composed of Hezbollah in Lebanon, various Iraqi Shia militias, the Houthis in Yemen, and Hamas in the Palestinian territories.
And they aren't just ideological allies, they are strategic military assets. If an adversary considers striking the Iranian homeland, they have to factor in the reality that Hezbollah might unleash thousands of missiles, or that the Houthis might disrupt global shipping choke points.
It complicates the adversary's calculus immensely.
And the architect of this moat, the man who operationalized this strategy for decades, was Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the IRGC's elite Quds force.
The sources detail Soleimani's instrumental role in weaving these disparate, geographically separated groups into a cohesive, transnational network of deterrence.
He was the linchpin.
He provided them with the technology, the training, and the ballistic capabilities born from Iran's autarky, turning them into formidable asymmetric threats.
And what's fascinating is how Soleimani leveraged this network, not just defensively to protect Iran, but proactively on the global stage. The sources recount a highly specific pivotal moment in 2015 Soleimani's trip to Moscow.
It is a masterclass in geopolitical maneuvering. The Syrian civil war was raging, and the government of Bashar al-Assad, a crucial Iranian ally, was on the verge of collapse. Soleimani traveled to Moscow to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin. He didn't just go to ask for a favor, he laid out a comprehensive strategic map.
He persuaded Putin that if the Syrian government fell to Western-backed rebels or extremist groups, it would be a disaster for Russian interests in the Middle East as well.
He essentially drafted the blueprint for the Russian military intervention in Syria because Soleimani recognized a vital logistical reality.
Right, the land bridge.
Exactly. Syria is the land bridge. If the Assad regime fell, the crucial supply line connecting Tehran to Hezbollah in Lebanon would be severed. The moat would be breached.
So he orchestrates a scenario where Russian air power provides the cover for Iranian-backed ground forces to save the Syrian state.
Which brings us back to that stunning interaction we opened with. The statesman quoting Immanuel Kant to Henry Kissinger.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
We see this massive network of asymmetric deterrence. We see this unyielding strategy of resistance. We see the tactical maneuvering in Syria. But what is the actual endgame? Iran knows it cannot march an army into Washington, D.C. It cannot conquer the United States.
Right, that's impossible.
Yeah.
So the Kantian long game becomes the only logical path. The strategy is not to win a definitive military victory. The strategy is to exhaust the adversary.
Exhaustion as victory.
To make the cost of remaining in the Middle East, the constant low-level proxy attacks, the political headaches, the financial drain of defending bases, so incredibly high that the United States eventually, over generations, decides the region is no longer worth the blood and treasure and packs up and leaves. It is a multi-generational game of geopolitical attrition.
And that game of attrition brings us to the most controversial, high-stakes piece of their entire deterrence strategy, the nuclear gambit.
This is where the historical irony is just breathtaking. There is a deeply surprising fact in the sources regarding the origins of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. For decades, the global narrative has been about stopping the Islamic Republic from obtaining nuclear technology.
Right.
But the civilian nuclear program didn't start with the Islamic Republic. It originated in the 1950s and 60s under the U.S.-backed Shah, with the active encouragement and blessing of the United States government, including Henry Kissinger himself.
The irony is profound. The Shah viewed nuclear capability as a ticket to prestige, a way to solidify Iran as a modern great power. The United States literally provided the initial research reactor.
Wow.
But when the Islamic Revolution occurred and the new republic eventually adopted and accelerated the program, they did so with an entirely different psychological framework. It wasn't about prestige.
No.
And despite Western fears, Nasr argues it wasn't driven by religious fervor to initiate an apocalypse. It was viewed as the ultimate untouchable deterrent.
They looked around the world and drew very specific, grim conclusions about how great powers treat smaller nations.
If we examine Iran's strategic consciousness, it is etched with cautionary tales.
Let's list them because it's important.
They look at Saddam Hussein in Iraq, who did not have a nuclear deterrent and was invaded and overthrown by the U.S. They look at Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who voluntarily gave up his nascent nuclear program to appease the West and was subsequently overthrown with NATO assistance.
And Ukraine?
Yes. They look at Ukraine, which surrendered its Soviet-era nuclear arsenal in the 1990s in exchange for security guarantees, only to be invaded decades later.
The lesson the Iranian strategists took from history is stark. Regimes that abandon their ultimate deterrence invite foreign invasion and destruction. In their minds, a nuclear program, or at least the threshold capability to build a weapon rapidly if needed, is the final unbreakable lock on the fortress door.
It guarantees that a regime change invasion will never happen.
Which makes the 2015 nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, so fascinating to analyze through Nasr's framework.
It does.
Let me push back on the hedgehog analogy here, though. If Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is the ultimate hedgehog, knowing only unyielding resistance, how do we explain the JCPOA? He authorized his diplomats to sit down with the United States and sign an agreement limiting their nuclear program. Isn't that a fox move? Isn't that compromise?
It is a brilliant question, and the sources address this directly. Vali Nasr frames the JCPOA not as the supreme leader abandoning his core ideology of resistance, but as a calculated tactical pause.
A tactical pause, okay.
The hedgehog recognized that the crushing weight of international economic sanctions was threatening the internal stability of the state. To preserve the republic, the ultimate goal, he allowed a temporary compromise on the nuclear issue to secure vital economic relief. It was a tactical retreat to ensure strategic survival.
But then the geopolitical winds shift. The United States unilaterally withdraws from the JCPOA and imposes the maximum pressure campaign.
And here, we must slow our pace and acknowledge the profound human cost of these grand geopolitical maneuvers, because the maximum pressure campaign was not just a clinical phrase used in think tanks. It was a devastating economic earthquake for the Iranian people.
The reality of it is truly devastating to read. The sources detail how these sanctions didn't just hurt the government. They systematically dismantled the daily lives of ordinary citizens. We are talking about...
Yes. Leading to severe shortages of basic, life-saving medicines and medical equipment. The once vibrant, robust Iranian middle class, the engine of the society, was essentially crushed under the weight of this economic isolation.
And as this economic suffering deepened, a profound, tragic disconnect emerged within the country. The sources describe it as a yawning chasm between the society and the state.
A very apt description.
On one side of this chasm, you have a society that is incredibly young, highly educated, and cosmopolitan in its outlook. The text explicitly points out a fascinating detail. Iranian youth consistently win gold medals in international math and physics Olympiads.
They are brilliant.
They're connected to the internet, and they are deeply integrated into the globalized world in their minds, their aspirations, and their understanding of human rights.
They are a 21st century populace, but on the other side of that chasm governing them, you have an aging, rigid state apparatus that enforces strict, unyielding ideological and social codes born from the revolution of 1979.
That's the friction.
The tension between this dynamic youth and the inflexible state, compounded by the heartbreak of economic ruin, created an unsustainable pressure cooker.
That pressure cooker reached a devastating boiling point in the year 2022. We must pause to honor the tragic, harrowing death of a young woman, Mahsa Amini, who died in the custody of the morality police after being detained for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly.
Her death was the spark that ignited a nationwide outpouring of accumulated grief, anger, and desperation. It was a profound, visceral revolt by the youth, particularly women, against the domination of religious strictures, the lack of economic future, and the crushing weight of the state's ideology.
The protests, operating under the banner of woman, life, freedom, shook the nation to its very core.
But the paradox of how this event was processed internally is crucial to understanding the future of the country.
Right.
In the West, these protests were viewed clearly and unequivocally as a domestic uprising for secular democracy, women's rights, and basic human dignity. But we have to look at how the supreme leader interpreted this anguish.
And this is where the hedgehog mentality becomes totalizing. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei viewed these protests entirely through the lens of national security and foreign interference.
Yes, he characterized the unrest not as a legitimate response to domestic failure or economic pain, but as a vast, highly orchestrated foreign plot.
It sounds like paranoia, but based on the history we've discussed, 1953, the grueling isolation of the 80s, you can see the mechanical logic of their paranoia.
Exactly. In his worldview, the United States and its allies engineered this domestic chaos precisely because Iran's grand strategy was working.
Because they were winning the long game.
Yes, because Iran was successfully projecting power, surviving maximum pressure, and winning the geopolitical proxy wars, the enemy had to resort to subversion from within to destabilize the state.
Wow.
Therefore, the defense of strict domestic codes like the hijab became, in the eyes of the state apparatus, synonymous with the defense of the homeland against foreign invasion. Any concession to the protesters was viewed as surrendering the fortress to the Americans.
So what does this all mean for us today? We have traced an incredible heavy arc. From the initial loneliness of the Safavid Empire, drawing a line in the sand, through the brutal trauma of the Iran-Iraq War, to the construction of a vast, complex network of asymmetric deterrence.
It is remarkable history.
We see a nation that has successfully projected power across the entire Middle East. They have deterred military superpowers. They have survived total war and near absolute economic strangulation. But they have achieved this at a staggering, deeply mournful, and perhaps ultimately unsustainable cost to their own citizens.
It leaves us standing at the twilight of a revolutionary era, staring into a deeply uncertain future. The sources point to an impending, monumental question that will reshape the region, the question of succession.
Right.
Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is in his 80s. When he inevitably passes, what path will Iran choose?
The text mentions a few possibilities. One is the potential succession of his son, Mujtaba Khamenei, a figure who has deep, abiding ties to the security apparatus and the IRGC. If that faction consolidates power, will they simply continue this hedgehog strategy of unyielding resistance? Could the Islamic Republic effectively morph away from its theological roots and become a hereditary militarized system dedicated entirely to endless forward defense and security?
Or is the immense, boiling societal pressure from that highly educated cosmopolitan youth eventually going to force a fundamental structural shift? Vali Nasr raises the profound question of whether Iran is approaching a Gorbachev moment.
Let's define that for our listeners. Mikhail Gorbachev was the final leader of the Soviet Union. He looked at a crumbling economy and an unwinnable Cold War and tried to enact perestroika and glasnost restructuring and openness.
He tried to reform the system to save it.
But the sudden openness accidentally collapsed the entire Soviet structure. Is the Iranian state terrified of exactly that?
They are terrified of it, but they may not be able to avoid it indefinitely. Will the state realize it can no longer bear the internal cost of total isolation and finally be forced to become a fox, adapting, compromising, and integrating with the world? Or will the fear of collapse keep the gates sealed shut?
It is a question that will undoubtedly define the geopolitical landscape of the 21st century. Will the ancient, proud fortress finally open its gates to the valley, or will it fortify its moats even deeper, preparing for a siege that may never truly end?
That is the profound reality you must ponder as you watch the history of tomorrow unfold.
And it is something for you to consider long after we finish speaking today. We want to thank you for joining us in this exploration. Keep questioning the headlines, keep digging into the mechanics of history, and never stop exploring the profound, often heartbreaking human complexities that drive the world. Until next time.